After my grandfather's heart finally gave out on a Tuesday morning in March, the family attorney revealed something that made my stepmother's wine glass shatter on the marble floor. I was the sole heir to his Vineyard estate, worth nearly $90 million. My stepfamily demanded I sign it over within the week, and when I refused, they showed up at dawn with a moving crew and a county sheriff to drag my belongings onto the gravel driveway. But they froze when they saw exactly who was standing on the porch steps beside me, coffee in hand, badge clipped to his belt. My name is Teresa, and I'm 36 years old. I'm a forensic accountant outside Sacramento, the kind of person who spends her days finding the dollar that doesn't add up in a spreadsheet of 10,000. If you've ever had family treat you like an obstacle standing between them and money that was never theirs, tell me where you're watching from. And stay with me, because what I found on my grandfather's hard drive, 3 days before they tried to throw me out, is the reason none of them will ever sleep easy again. The funeral had ended 4 hours earlier. I was sitting alone in my grandfather Walter Doyle's study at Whitfield Hill, the 80-acre vineyard he'd built from a failing pear orchard back in 1979, running my thumb over the worn leather cover of his old appointment book. The house still smelled like the gardenias my grandmother used to keep on the windowsill before she passed 6 years ago. I hadn't even changed out of my black dress when the front door banged open hard enough to rattle the windows. I didn't jump. I already knew who it was. My stepbrother Trevor came through first, his loafers slapping against the hardwood like he owned the place, which in his mind he already did. Behind him was my stepsister Kristen, and trailing her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but smiling that oily real estate smile anyway, was her husband Owen Pierce, a land development consultant who'd built half the strip malls between here and Modesto. They weren't wearing black anymore. Somewhere between the cemetery and here, they'd shed the grieving act like a coat they didn't need indoors. Trevor walked straight up to the desk and slapped his palm down on it so hard my grandfather's reading glasses jumped and clattered to the floor. "Playtime's over, Teresa," he says it, his face already flushed. "Pack your stuff and get out before I have you removed." I bent down to pick up the glasses, careful not to let the lenses crack on the hardwood. Owen stepped forward before I could even straighten up, dropping a thick manila folder onto the desk with a slap that knocked over the cold cup of coffee I'd been nursing since the burial. He didn't flinch. He just adjusted his watch, the same calm motion of a man who thought the math was already settled in his favor. "Let me break this down for you in terms you'll understand," Owen said, his voice syrupy with condescension. "This is an emergency quitclaim filing, approved by a judge 2 hours ago. Under the temporary estate provisions, Trevor is now acting administrator of the Doyle Family Trust, and effective immediately, this vineyard is collateral against a corporate bridge loan. You have no seat on the board. You have no legal right to be standing in this room." I looked down at the red notary stamp pressed into the corner of the page. My mind started doing what it always does, the thing that pays my mortgage, finding what doesn't fit. You don't get a judge to sign off on an emergency eviction and register a $90 million property as loan collateral 2 hours after a funeral. Paperwork like that doesn't happen in 2 hours. It happens over months, quietly, by people who know exactly what they're doing and exactly when they intend to do it. Which meant Trevor and Owen had been building this long before my grandfather's heart ever stopped. Kristen crossed her arms and gave me a long, slow once-over, the kind reserved for something she'd scraped off her shoe. "God, you look pathetic," she said, sitting in an 80-acre estate in a thrift store dress. "You were never going to inherit this place, Teresa. Grandpa Walter didn't build a wine empire so some glorified number cruncher could run it into the ground." She trailed her fingers along the bookshelf, already redecorating in her head. "Mom and Dad let you take out $110,000 in student loans for that accounting degree because nobody actually believed in you. Trevor got the seed money for his restaurant group because he was the real heir. You're just the disappointment who counts other people's money for a living." I let that sit in the air without giving her anything back. The truth was simpler and uglier than she knew. My stepfamily had cut me off financially the second I refused to be agreeable, and I'd worked 2 jobs through my 20s while they funded Trevor's failing restaurants with money that should have gone toward my grandfather's retirement care. My silence only made Trevor angrier. He kicked the leg of the desk hard enough to send a stack of folders sliding to the floor. "You're a stepchild with delusions," he spat, close enough now that I caught the bourbon on his breath even though it wasn't even noon. "You don't have any blood right to this estate." Sign the transfer agreement and walk out that door, or I will have you walked out. He pulled a pen from his jacket and slammed it down on the contract. The crack of metal on wood made Kristen flinch, but I kept my eyes locked on Trevor's face. Up close under all that bluster, his jaw was tight and his pupils were too wide. He wasn't acting like a man who'd just inherited a fortune. He was acting like a man with a clock running out somewhere behind his eyes. Owen leaned over the desk to box me in, his voice dropping low. I'm only going to say this once. Pick up the pen and sign away your occupancy rights. If you refuse, the enforcement clause activates automatically. Tomorrow at 9 sharp, my crew and the county sheriff will be on that porch. We'll have your bags on the curb and the locks changed by 10, with the local news van parked right there on the road, if that's what it takes to make you understand this is over. The quiet that followed was broken by the click of heels on hardwood. My stepmother, Carol. No, I caught myself even mid-thought. She'd lost the right to that title the second she walked into this room with that expression. Diane stepped out of the hallway, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, dressed for a magazine spread rather than a wake. She'd clearly been waiting for the men to soften me up before she swept in to play the wounded mother figure. She sat beside me on the leather couch and took my hand, her fingers cold as a vise dressed up as comfort. Teresa, honey, please just listen to your brother. You've always been so stubborn, but this isn't the moment for it. Trevor's restaurant group is drowning in debt. If we don't liquidate this property fast, we lose everything. The house in Carmel, the club membership, all of it. Be the good daughter for once. This family needs you to make a sacrifice. I looked down at her hand wrapped around mine and felt something settle cold and final in my chest. She wasn't mourning my grandfather, the man whose money had clothed and fed her for 15 years. She was mourning the possibility of losing her zip code. To her, I had only ever been insurance. Collateral to be cashed in the moment her favorite child made one bad bet too many. I slid my hand out from under hers, slow and deliberate. Whatever thin thread of obligation I still felt toward this woman snapped clean in that second. While Diane composed herself, I caught Trevor pulling Owen toward the bay window, both of them thinking they were far enough away to talk privately. The old farmhouse had 13-foot ceilings that carried sound straight back to wherever I was sitting, a fact none of them had ever bothered to learn in the 15 years I'd spent visiting this place. The wire has to clear before Thursday, or the whole bridge loan collapses, Owen muttered. If the auditors get into the trust accounts before we liquidate, we're both looking at fraud charges that'll make the restaurant thing look like a parking ticket. I sat very still and listened to two men casually discuss committing a felony in a room where my grandfather's ashes hadn't even settled into the ground yet. When they finally left that evening, after Trevor's final threat about handcuffs and humiliation, I didn't sleep. I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened his old laptop, the one the lawyer had handed me in a manila envelope along with his watch and his wedding ring. Tucked into the leather folio beside it was a small slip of paper in his handwriting. A phone number, and beneath it, for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Use this if the wolves ever come for the Vineyard. I'd thought it was a strange, paranoid note from an old man who watched too many crime shows. I understood now it wasn't paranoia. It was a man who'd seen exactly what his own children were capable of long before I ever did. I dialed the number. It connected on the first ring, no dial tone, just a sharp click and a voice that sounded like it had been waiting. State your authorization code, the man said. Walter Doyle, Irrevocable Trust, Priority Access, this is Teresa. A pause, typing. When he spoke again, the bureaucratic flatness was gone. Mrs. Doyle, your grandfather told me this call might come. We've had eyes on a shell company tied to Owen Pierce's development firm for 14 months, waiting for someone connected to pull the trigger on a fraud we couldn't quite prove yet. Tell me, they made a move. They made several, I said, keeping my voice level even though my hands weren't. Trevor Doyle and Owen Pierce forged an emergency eviction notice. They're planning to physically remove me from a federally relevant property at 9 tomorrow morning, using a sheriff's deputy and a moving crew, in order to liquidate it before a trust audit catches a financial shortfall they can't explain. How large a shortfall? I don't have the exact number yet. But I'm about to. He gave me a low whistle that had nothing friendly in it. A forced eviction using law enforcement against a federally monitored estate elevates this fast. I'll have a unit positioned out of sight by 8:40. We let them commit the act before we move. You understand what that means. You have to let them get close enough to actually do it. I understand exactly what it means, I said. After I hung up, I went back to the laptop, intending to back up the trust files before I handed everything over to the agents in the morning. That's when I noticed a folder at the bottom of the directory I hadn't seen before, named simply N4009TD, the tail number of my grandfather's old Cessna, the one he kept at the regional airfield and still flew himself twice a month. Right up until 3 weeks ago when the engine failed over the foothills and killed him on impact. The official report had called it mechanical failure. Bad luck. An old engine finally giving out on an old man. I opened the folder expecting maintenance logs. Instead, there was a single scanned wire transfer receipt from an offshore account in the Caymans. The sender was Briarwood Capital, which I now recognized from the trust documents as one of Owen's shell companies. The amount was $180,000. The recipient was the private mechanic who serviced my grandfather's plane. The transfer had cleared 2 days before the crash. I sat with that for a long time, the kind of stillness where your body goes numb before your mind catches up. This wasn't an old engine failing, this wasn't bad luck. My grandfather hadn't died in an accident. Someone had paid to make sure his plane fell out of the sky before he could finish whatever audit he was apparently already circling. And the someone who'd benefit most from his silence was sitting in a kitchen 40 miles from here right now, sleeping soundly, dreaming about wine country real estate. My stepmother had asked me to sacrifice for the son who had murdered her own father. The grief in me didn't disappear. It just changed shape, hardening into something with a purpose. By 8:40 the next morning, I was standing in the kitchen in the same charcoal suit I wear when I'm called in to testify against billionaires laundering money through shell nonprofits. I'd worn it for boardrooms. Today I was wearing it to take apart my own family. At 9 sharp, the gravel driveway erupted with the sound of tires. 2 SUVs and a moving truck tore through the open gate without slowing, tearing fresh ruts across the lawn my grandmother had spent 30 years cultivating. Owen got out first, adjusting his tie, already smiling like a man who'd already won. Behind him came the sheriff's deputy, a man named Hendricks, who looked deeply uncomfortable, holding a clipboard he clearly hadn't read closely enough. Trevor and Kristen climbed out of the second SUV, and Diane stepped out last, dressed like she was attending a press conference, rather than evicting her stepdaughter from a house full of her late husband's memories. I walked out onto the porch steps to meet them, coffee in hand, and that's when the man beside me stepped into view. Agent Marcus Whitfield, who I'd met for the first time at 6 that morning when his team quietly took position in the old barn and the tree line along the eastern fence. He didn't say a word. He just stood there in his windbreaker with the federal seal on the chest, watching. The color drained from Trevor's face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Who is that?" Kristen said, her voice cracking on the second word. "This is Teresa's home," I said. "And you're trespassing." Owen recovered first because men like Owen always do, snapping his folder open like the paperwork would somehow undo a federal agent standing 6 feet away. "This is a legally executed eviction, sir. I'd advise you to step back and let..." "Pierce," Agent Whitfield said, calm as still water. "I'm going to need you to set that folder down and step away from the porch. We have a warrant for the financial records associated with Briarwood Capital, and a few questions about a wire transfer that cleared 2 days before Walter Doyle's plane went down." The silence that followed had a physical weight to it. I watched it land on each of them differently. Owen's jaw working soundlessly, Trevor's hand gripping the porch rail like it was the only thing keeping him upright, Kristen looking between her husband and her brother like she was only now realizing she didn't actually know what either of them had done. "That's insane," Trevor said, too loud, the way people get when the floor is disappearing under them. "That plane went down because of an engine fault. The NTSB already. The NTSB report is being reopened this morning," Whitfield said. Given the new information. Diane's composure cracked first, the perfectly arranged grief sliding off her face to reveal something closer to panic. "Trevor, what is he talking about? What did you do?" "Nothing," Trevor said, except his voice shook on the word, and I watched 25 years of careful denial collapse in real time on my stepmother's face. 2 more agents came around from the side of the house, and I watched Owen get walked to one of the SUVs while he was still trying to explain himself in a voice that kept climbing higher and higher, the smug real estate cadence completely gone, replaced by something closer to begging. Trevor didn't go quietly. He turned to me at the last second, something desperate breaking through the anger. "You did this! You set us up! You set yourselves up the day you decided Grandpa Walter was worth more dead than alive," I said. "I just made the phone call." Diane reached for my arm as they led her toward the second vehicle, her grip suddenly weak where it had been a vise the day before. Teresa, please, I'm your family. Whatever he did, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve and felt nothing where I once might have felt the ghost of obligation. Not anger, not pity. Just a quiet, total emptiness where 15 years of trying to belong to these people used to live. Blood doesn't forge eviction papers on the day of a funeral, I said. Blood doesn't ask a daughter to hand over the inheritance of the man your own son murdered. You knew enough. You knew exactly what kind of son you raised, and you decided his comfort mattered more than your father's life. That's not family. That's just people who happen to share a roof with me. I stepped back out of her reach and looked at the deputy, who was staring at his own paperwork like it had personally betrayed him. You can go ahead and tell your office that eviction notice won't be necessary. He nodded and got back in his cruiser without another word. I stood on the gravel and watched all three of them loaded into separate vehicles, watched the iron gate swing shut behind the convoy as it pulled away down the long drive between the vine rows my grandfather had planted with his own hands 40 years ago. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the particular kind of tired that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. It took the better part of a year to untangle everything. Trevor pleaded guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Owen didn't get that luxury, and the murder for hire charge connected to the mechanic's testimony meant he wouldn't see daylight again until he was an old man, if then. Diane was never charged with anything. The prosecutors said there wasn't enough to prove she'd known in advance. But she lost the house in Carmel, the club membership, all of it, swallowed by restitution and legal fees. The last I heard, she was renting a one-bedroom outside Fresno. I didn't go looking for that information. Someone else told me, and I let it pass through me without much weight at all. I kept Whitfield Hill. I replanted the section of Vineyard that had gone fallow during the worst of my grandmother's illness, and I hired back the crew my grandfather had used for 30 years. The ones Trevor had quietly started laying off the week of the funeral to cut costs before the sale went through. A year later, almost to the day, I stood on that same porch with the two people who'd actually shown up when everything fell apart. My best friend, Renee, who'd driven 4 hours the morning of the raid just to sit with me in case it went badly, and her husband, Dominic, who'd spent 6 months helping me rebuild the tasting room without ever once asking for anything back. We opened a bottle from the first harvest since the trial, the cork coming free with a sound that felt like punctuation on something long overdue. To Walter, Dominic said, raising his glass toward the rows of vines glowing gold in the late afternoon light. To Walter, I echoed, and took a slow sip, feeling the weight of the whole year settle into something almost like peace. I told them that night that I'd finalized the paperwork for a new foundation in my grandfather's name, a fund to help women contest fraudulent estate seizures, to put lawyers and forensic accountants like me in the corner of anyone whose own family decided they were worth more as a liability than a person. Renee cried. Dominic just nodded slowly, like it made perfect sense because it did. My family tried to convince me that loyalty meant silence, that love meant letting people who'd already decided I was disposable take whatever they wanted from me. I learned, standing in that study with my grandfather's reading glasses in my hand, that the truest kind of loyalty is to the people who never asked you to disappear for their comfort. The best revenge was never the federal agents on the porch or the headlines that followed. It was waking up every morning in a house that was rightfully mine, surrounded by vines my grandfather planted with his own 2 hands, finally free of people who only ever loved me conditionally. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, I hope you choose yourself. Tell me in the comments how you learned to walk away.